Our lesson here in just a moment. Tonight we are continuing with our study, but for perhaps the first time, we're going to get a little closer to home in our study this evening. So you may be a little more familiar with what we talk about this evening, and then we'll continue with it here in the next couple of weeks as well. As you can see on the board there, our title for this evening is lesson number 10. And tonight it is Causes and Roots of the Restoration. I debated. I feel like I titled it wrong. I felt like it should be Roots and Causes, not Causes and Roots. I don't know, that bothered me just a little bit. But the things that I guess I noticed right there, I feel like a root is lower and then that causes problems. But don't hold it against me. We'll just click on to the next page and nobody will even know. So, but roots and causes. But when you think about roots, what do you think of? So beginnings, the figurative term here. What do we have? Trees. What did you say? Weeds. All right. So something growing. All right. So we think about things that are rooted, right? Rooted into the ground. Back in the summer, the property that is behind Mom and Dad's house has a tree that's roots were growing into Mom and Dad's property, and they were it's growing into their fence. So we went back and we cut it down, but the roots are still even there. And Dad had to go back then a few weeks later and cut up the roots. Tom, you may have been involved in that as well there. But, you know, people that have to defend themselves usually have something to hide, is what I would say. I don't know if I ask. All I know is that turned into a job where we went to Maria's house and ran the shredder for seemed like forever that morning as well. So it was. But anyway, but we know what roots are, and roots, are take hold, right? And those roots are what keep that tree steady. All right. And so when we think about tonight, we're going to be talking about the restoration. And I said that you're going to see things that are familiar to you. But our dates tonight are like 220 years ago. But there are roots on trees in this county right now that went into the ground 220 years ago. And some of those are maybe creeping up out of the ground a little bit as well. There was a tree at Lancaster Elementary by the playground that all the roots were out of the ground. They were everyone out of the ground. And we would climb over them and jump on them and all that. And you may have trees like that at your home as well. But roots are what provides the strength. That's where the food comes from. That they pull that water in, and it's where the support of the strength comes from. But let's talk about this. Go ahead. The xylem, and yes, that's right, up and down. All right. So when we think about the word restore, all right, so we're talking about restoration. To restore here, this is by definition, I guess, the action of returning something to a former owner, to a former place, to a former condition. Okay, and so you may have restored something, meaning that you gave it to something. Maybe that had been in their family, and somehow it come to you, and they gave it to them. A former place. You may be familiar with homes that have been restored. They're restoration projects for old houses made into something nicer or newer, or tried to make them exactly the way they were in the old time as well. And then a condition, right? Restored it to its previous condition. And I want us to think about all of those things because in many ways, when we talk about the restoration with the church, it's doing the same thing. Now, you'll see there where it says the restoration movement. And I want to be very clear about something. Just like every other quote unquote movement that we've talked about, I don't know that anybody in particular sat down and said, this is going to be a movement. And we're going to do this. And I'm going to get this person and this person. A lot of times things just are sort of happening. And sometimes things are happening in multiple places that all sort of coalesce with one another. But nonetheless, it's a movement that we could say, early Christian movement that begins on the frontier of the United States during the late 17 and early 1800s. We're talking about a 40-year-ish period right here. But we're talking about places that are close to where we are. We'll talk more about this as we go. As you see there, the leaders of this movement, and we'll use the word again, leaders here, in sort of a broad sense as well. But the people involved in this were looking to, I see the word reform here. Now, it's not the word restore, but looking to reform the church from within, and sought the unification of all Christians in a single body patterned after the church in the New Testament. So I wanted us to start with the word reform, because that's what we've been talking about. But we're going to move to the word restore shortly thereafter. Modern religious groups that would emerge from this, you'll see three right there. The Churches of Christ, which you're sitting in right now. You may be familiar with independent or conservative Christian churches. I'm sure there's some in Lincoln County. There's several in Garrett County, in different parts of the community as well. And then also the Christian church, it's probably called the Christian church, usually more specifically called the Disciples of Christ. But they all trace themselves back to this movement. And we'll get into all that in a few weeks with what that is. But these are the groups that you would be familiar with. So let's talk a little bit about what is restoration here to start with. And so as the 18th century ends, as the 19th century begins, there was this desire for, tell me if you've seen this word before, this desire to return to the old paths, all right? That comes from Jeremiah chapter 6 and 16. The primitive, and I use the word primitive not in a negative sense, but the original sense of the early church. Let's look at Jeremiah 6:16 right here. Lucille, do you care to read this for us, please, dear? I kind of wanted to leave that last sentence off for just a second, because I think this is sort of fitting for people throughout time, right? It says, thus says the Lord, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Now, hold on for just a second. But the old paths were the good way. If there's a defined or a described good way, then that means there's also what other kind of way? There's a bad way, all right? And I don't know what good and bad would necessarily mean, but you can figure it out for anything, right? There's good food to eat and there's bad food to eat. You know, there's good places to go and there's bad places to go. Well, this would be a good path and a bad path as well. But it says where the good way is, then do what? Walk in it for what reason? To find rest for your soul, to find comfort, to be made better as a result. When I was getting this ready, I was thinking about Jimmy with his surgery, right? You have found some rest and comfort in this surgery, I would hope. Not that you weren't able to move forward in the past, but hopefully this makes it just a little bit better. You know, you were going down a path, and then the new path has opened up something better for you. So I want us to go back, though, to the very beginning, because it says, thus what? Thus says the Lord. Read the last sentence. All right. So who spoke first? Right here. They would be the people he's talking to. Tell him what? No thanks, right? No thanks. So this is a situation here where people are being told the right way to go, and they say what? No thank you. I'm going to go this way. All right. I'm going to go this way. Well, Jimmy, when they met with you about that surgery, if you had said, nah, I'm going to go this way, you'd have been okay. You'd have went on. But I'm not sure that another month or 6 months or another year, and you might have been in a wheelchair, right? It very well could have been the case. But you have to make a decision. Well, it's the same thing with our religious ideas, right? We can say, well, we're going to go this way. But if I don't go that way, if I'm being told the good way and don't go, I'm making a poor decision. And so the desire here of this restoration movement in its broadest sense was to choose the good way, the proper path, the right path. But not everybody went. Let's go a little further. A few different things here for us to look at. So most of these restorers felt what was needed was not a reformation or a reformation, which was the word we used a second ago of the church, but instead a complete and full return to the church of the first century. Sometimes you can only fix things so much. You can only reform them so much. You may know of things that you have had in your life, and you had it repaired 2 or 3 or 4 different times. A buddy of mine that I work with, his truck has been repaired like 4 times, and it broke down on the way to work the other day, and he called, and they said, it's going to cost $800 to fix it. And he said, I don't know that it wouldn't be worth $400 right now. And he said, he's worked on it and worked on it and worked on it. He says, it might be time. Reforming ain't going to work anymore. We might have to just start it back over just a little bit. And so these people, as you can see here, were expressing dissatisfaction with Protestant, the word that we used a few weeks ago, not Catholic denominations. And so part of the complaint was, as you can see here, that there was all of these different creeds, names, doctrines, and practices. You remember last week when I said, tell me, have you heard of this church? And you said, yes. And then we gave like 5, 6 different ones, and we'd all heard of them. Well, here's the thing. All of those were efforts to reform something. If I were to come in here and tear up every single pew, and I said, I want you to reform the pew the way you see fit, we have 20 pews in here. They're all going to look different, right? Because your opinion of what this pew needs to look like is going to be different from somebody else. Well, the problem then is when I come back in here and there's 20 different pews and they've all been redone a different way, what's the right one? What's the best one? Well, one of them might be able to hold some, but maybe not others. This is an example, but the point of this is to show that reform ends up actually leading to some problems that were maybe unanticipated. Third thing right here, there was the rejection of this idea that our religious destiny, if you would say, depended on a choice between Protestantism or Catholicism. Instead of having to make this choice, the idea was that your salvation depended on what we see here, an acceptance of this pattern of Christianity that had sort of went away. Because this previous idea, what we were being presented with, was all flawed. It was all flawed. Everything, I'm not saying it was 100% wrong. When we looked at all of those people that were reformers, they all had great ideas. When we left church the other night, Wednesday night, a couple weeks ago, Mary said, remember Ulrich Zwingli? He was really ugly, all right? You remember him, don't you, Melvin? All right, remember him? What Mary said, she said, Zwingli was ugly. I'm sorry if his family members are watching 500 years later. She said, Zwingli was ugly, but she said, I think I agreed with most of what he said. Well, we looked at every single one of them, and all of you said, okay, yeah, there's some good points here, but I don't necessarily agree with everything there. And so what had to happen was this return to sort of the origin, return to the original, return to New Testament Christianity. You can see here, the purpose was to go all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to the start, before synods, before councils, creeds, disciplines, sects, parties, and restore the church as it was revealed in the New Testament. The whole point of what we've been studying in this, lesson 1, was about the church that was revealed in the New Testament. And I hope you've noticed that as we went from lesson 1 to lesson 9, actually lesson 1 to about lesson 7, we drifted further and further away. And we tried to sort of wind back in the last couple episodes, not TV show, last couple of classes, and then tonight, the first effort to actually restore. When we use the word restoration, I want to look at 5 principles, and I'll let you comment about this here as we go. Number 1, restoration principle number 1, there was a recognition that Christ, Jesus, was the supreme authority in religion, and that the New Testament was the only rule of faith and practice. Right? So let's talk about that for just a second. Break down, this is not a Bible verse, but this is a principle or a belief. So break this verse or this principle down for me. Explain this to me. All right. So that's the authority. Okay, so that would be the authority in religion. Okay, so we've established that as the authority, and sometimes authority can be debated, right? Who am I listening to about this? Sometimes we see this in government. There's state government, and there's also federal government. One says one and says the other. Where's my authority at right here? Well, right here we see the same thing. Christ is the supreme authority. All right, what's the next part? Okay, and those are established where? In the New Testament. Okay, and the New Testament's an important point for us to see right there. The second thing, a proper distinction between the Old and the New Testament. Okay? So much of what we saw in our earlier classes was this sort of tethering to the old law, to the Old Testament. There was this desire in many cases by priests to be the high priest. The high priest had this rule right here. Well, is there a high priest in the New Testament? Or at least should I say, is there a high priest after the death of Jesus? There's no earthly high priest. There's no person who has that role as a leadership role. And so the Old Testament and the New Testament, two completely different things. I think this second point is really important about something that I sometimes see, although I haven't seen it as much. I see people that are adamant that the 10 Commandments must be posted everywhere. I think their heart's in the right place, but where in your Bible do you find the 10 Commandments? In the Old Testament. What happened to the old law? It was nailed to the cross. Now, can I learn from the old law? Yes, but I'd be much better to post the commandments of what Jesus taught, right? I'd be far better suited to post the Beatitudes than I would be to post the 10 Commandments, right? But there's a separation between that, and not every religious group will believe that, okay? Not every religious group would say that. Number 3, a recognition of the New Testament pattern of the church. I say church as an entity. We started this lesson all the way back at the beginning by saying each church was to have what? Each congregation was to have what? Autonomy. Very good. That you don't rule anybody else. You rule your own. And what else? Elders. A plurality of elders right there. Now, how many lessons in were we before that plurality of elders kind of went away? We found 2 days into it, right? That sort of went away. But this idea of what the church was designed was to have a plurality of elders. We have a plurality of elders here. We have an autonomous church here. That doesn't mean you don't interact with other churches. That doesn't mean you can't do things with other churches. We used to have group singings with Danville and Stanford and Lane. There's nothing wrong with any of that. There's nothing wrong with the preacher from one going to none of that. You can have a joint vacation Bible school. All of that's fine. But you as elders have no authority over any other church. And you shouldn't. Ben, why do you not need authority over the churches beyond where you are here? Right. Right. Sure. And so that's the idea of the New Testament pattern of the church. Number 4, the autonomy of the local church, which we sort of jumped on there just a second ago. And then the last one, an important one here, a unity of all Christians. What does this mean?
That's something Christian humanity struggles with immensely. We all got our team against that.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible does not teach it. God loves one church, one faith, one everything. But
right.
We divide ourselves up into so many different groups, and it just hinders the growth.
That's why we're concerned about the Christians in India,
right?
Africa, or we got a letter the other day that's the relief fund. They show what they were doing on, which is all everybody knows North Carolina and Florida. They had an island.
Right. Right.
We're concerned about Christians in Ireland.
Sure.
California,
right.
There are brothers and sisters in Christ.
Absolutely. And so there's this, and what we'll see, and we'll go forward with this a little bit more in just a second, but this divide that Ben talked about here just a second ago was very much prominent. I showed you this map a couple weeks ago, and I want to look at it for just a second here this evening. There's 2 things I want to look at. First of all, if you look at this map, you may remember that we looked at it. Each color sort of represents the church or the religion that was prominent in the area. So the green is the Anglican or the Church of England. We talked about King Henry VIII and wanted the new wife, and they created a church. Well, these green areas were the Anglican church. And you can see there's a lot of green here: Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. The yellow is congregational. Very much Calvinist religion. The early Pilgrims for Thanksgiving time, they were congregational. Lutheran, we talked about how the people that were followers of Lutheran, he didn't want them to use the name, but they did. And then this pinkish color, which is Presbyterian, which was extremely heavy in like Pennsylvania and Virginia. If you trace your family's history back, everyone came here from Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. That's how everyone came. Every person here. Maria, not yours. But everybody else probably came here. Maria just showed up one day. But everybody else came from that roughly same generation. So if you go all the way back, if you go back 300 years, odds are that most of your people would have been Anglican or Presbyterian. Right? Now we have some other groups. These dots aren't real clear, but Baptist, Roman Catholic, we also have Jewish people in other areas, and then those are the Reformed churches, and Quaker was mentioned there as well. There are 5 to 6 larger denominations. That's what these are right here. Numerous smaller, but only about 20% of the population was connected to a religion at all in the early United States. Only about 20%. So 1 out of every 5 people were connected to a religion. Part of that was they had came to the U.S. in part to escape this division, this rivalry, this jealousy that Bill was talking about a minute ago, this war. You remember we talked about it a couple weeks ago in Germany, 40% of people died during the wars over religion. So they had come to avoid this. I want to show you this chart right here. This is the share of Americans identified as members in any religious community. Okay? So in any religious community, so any religious group. You have dates running across here every 11 years from 1700 to 2008. The word American here does not necessarily mean United States, but people who live in America. If you look at this chart, in 1700, 40% of the people would claim some tie to a religion of some sort. So 4 out of 10, 2 out of every 5 people. Today, it's about, what is that, about 60%, give or take a little bit. The time period that we're talking about the Restoration Movement, is right here within this yellow circle. Shorty, you're supposed to yell at me. All right. So this yellow chart right here, this is between 1777 and 1810. So this is roughly the Restoration period. Notice where the line is. About 20%, actually never higher than 20%. So less than 20% of the people in America were connected to any religious group at all. I don't mean, send them to a church, but, when it comes to word, no connection at all. So when we're talking about the Restoration Movement, you're looking at 4 out of every 5 people with no religious identity. How open is the field is there's 4 out of 5 people that are not. Why?
I remember reading up here, Logan County, where one point they had 35 solutions in the county, Logan County, 1800, and 0 prevalence.
Right.
0. That's incredible.
So I wanted you to see these numbers just to get a sense of where we are. And this is 1777, is the start of the American Revolution. 1810 is roughly the start of the Restoration Movement right there. Now, why was there any need for it? Well, because other things had failed previously. My buddy whose truck broke down. The only reason it broke down is because it had failed in something previously, right? They hadn't been fixed. And so the Reformation we talked about here in the last few weeks had been a desire to move back toward proper Christianity, if you want to use that word, but it had not always been perfect. In many ways, it was an effort to reform the Catholic Church, the universal church, the church that had sort of mongrelized, if you want to use that word, from the starting point to what it had later become. And its problem was that it had probably achieved as much as it could because all these different groups had split into different areas. Some, you see here, realized the need for reform could only come if there was a complete reestablishment of the New Testament, that should say New Testament church, not with redressing of denominationalism, not with just sort of, you know what it's like when you have, maybe we moved the couch to a different part of the house and it makes it look a little better, right? Well, does that fix your house? No, you're just kind of dressing it up a little bit. And so the thought was that the church had to be completely changed. We can't just move the couch from one spot to another and hopefully that'll fix what needed to be fixed. And so the Reformation, this previous stuff we talked about, had developed its own rigid system of religion. And so all of those groups that we talked about, these other religious groups, they had become very rigid and said, this is the only way and not that. And people would say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure if that's the right way either. We're going to look to finish this evening at a few different, what we would call failures of the Reformation. Things that had went wrong. All right, so bear with me. We've got about 4, maybe 5 that we'll look at. Number 1, we've talked about this before, but there had been this emergence of what we would call an arrogant clergy. Tell me what the word arrogant means. Big-headed. All right. Puffed up, self-important. Know anybody that's arrogant? You love being around arrogant. Are you saying you do? You are the one, Tom? Is that what you're saying right there? Okay. All right. That would be the definition of arrogant right there. So a lot of religious leaders, we talked about the word clergy here, had sort of made this place for themselves where they're here and the congregants, the worshipers, are here. There were words that were being tossed about. We see right up here the word reverend. Word, that's not the right thing. Title that's being tossed about. All right. The titles that were there. And you probably know of some other titles that are given to preachers or religious leaders as well. Those titles that were there. I would venture to say that whatever you want to call me, and hopefully it's nice, but I don't need any title beyond what? My name, right? Really, that's all that I need. Now, can you tell somebody that I'm the preacher of the church or I'm the teacher of the Wednesday night class? Of course, but don't capitalize it. Don't make it to be, in any kind of special name or title or anything like that. Because if my name is here, what's your name? If you put my name up here, where's your name got to go? It's going to be down here. So I'm higher than you, right? So is that what we want? It's pretty easy to get the big head, Tom. If you're up here and everybody else, you keep everybody else down here along the way. And so what we see here is this, a lot of cases, that high-ranking preacher becomes the lawmaker for the congregation. Who's the lawmaker, if we want to use that word, in the congregation? The elders are. The elders are. Not the preacher, not the reverend or pastor in the sense that it's become used in many cases today. But that's what's assigned to local eldership. So this was a complaint that people have. Anything about this before we go any further?
You see the same thing happen to the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
With the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees elevating themselves and putting other people down there and causing a rift between them and the people.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
And I just looked at a couple names. The reverend, the very reverend, the right reverend, or his lordship.
Right.
And those are just simple names. His lordship.
Yeah,
Going too far.
it is. I think it's an opinion question. I don't know that I have an answer to it. So, right. I don't know. I don't have one, so you don't got to call me that. So, Dr. Dan. All right. Second thing. Notice the picture that we have there. The picture's there on purpose. How many of you are familiar with where it says the way, the truth, and the life, right? But where do these arrows point? All different ways. What is the way, the truth, and the life? Well, there's the argument that there was an unclear theology. There's an unclear, what are we supposed to be doing? We go back to Europe here, but a lot of these reformers had based their teaching on scripture, but also on local politics as well. We talked about that for a couple of weeks. English teaching was influenced by the king. The king said, do this. You kind of got to do it, right? French was a little bit different, a little more skeptical in what they were doing right there. The Swiss and the German states, they gave the local place, they gave the ability to make their own decision. So Lancaster makes one decision, Stanford makes another decision. And so people were kind of confused and often left citizens, and in many cases denominations as well, unclear as to what are my exact beliefs. Because I'm kind of being told what my beliefs are, but my beliefs seem to be very similar as his, but he lives in one town and I live in another, and so therefore it can be very unclear, very unclear. We see a rise or an emergence of unbelief, not disbelief, but unbelief within religion as well. And you can see here, there was a desire to fix the church, but in the ways that it fixed it, sometimes locked it into inflexibility as well. Let's go back to Jimmy's knee for a second. Jimmy, they give you that brace, right? You have that brace, and you can't move that leg if you wanted to the way they did. What they want to do is they want his leg to get better. Mary had the same brace, right? But eventually you got to come out of that brace, because what's going to happen to your leg if you keep it locked in there from now on? It ain't never going to work. And the fixing hasn't really fixed it at all. And so a lot of people, the religious beliefs were so inflexible that they struggled with it. As we said a minute ago, people became skeptical of the church. They started questioning, why is the church doing this? Is it because they're trying to be in good favor with the king? Is it because they're trying to be in good favor with political leaders or whomever it might would be? And so a lot of people start moving to the U.S., and there's millions of reasons, and it's not just a religious reason, but people did move to the U.S. and in many cases broke ties with the churches that they had previously been part of. And the further they moved west, and Kentucky is west for the sake of this argument, the further they moved west, the less restrictions there were in what they were doing, right? They're a long way from any kind of ties, especially to old countries as well. But because of this movement, they were also sort of untethered from their faith. And when we said a minute ago, what was the percentage of people that were religious at this time? 20%, right? And so if there's no religion, it's hard to have a religion, right? It's hard to have that. A couple other things, and then we'll finish up. This might seem like a good thing. It was in some cases a good thing, in some cases maybe a bad thing, but increased Bible circulation. We talked a few weeks ago about printing and how printing became more available, and more people had the ability to buy books and buy Bibles because they were cheaper and they were more available. And so people start studying the Bible themselves, and they start saying, well, I'm not sure what I'm seeing here. This doesn't jive with what I've been told. And I also don't understand why there's this division, because it seems like it's pretty straightforward what we're going to do, but you're saying this and they're saying that. What's in this for you? Why are you talking about it this way? And so this rise of what we would call denominationalism, people said that's preventing the unity that Christ had prayed for. I'm going to go forward and then we'll come back to this for a second. This is John chapter 17, verse 20 and 21. Jimmy, do you care to read this, sir? So there's a couple of things here I want to look at. He says, I do not pray for these alone, the people he's talking about right there, but also for those, what does this say right here? Who will believe, meaning what? Do they believe now? No, but in the future, these people who will believe in me and through their word, that they all may be what? That they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you. And so this unity, Jesus says that he and God are united as one. And that what do we need to be, because we're on that list of those who would believe in the future, because we didn't exist at this time, where do we need to be united with? We need to be united there with Christ, that they may also be one in, what does this say? What does us mean? The Godhead, multiple, right? Not just one thing, but in us, that the world may then what? World then may believe that you see me. So there's this desire for unity, and people are saying, I don't see that the church is very united. We have to fix this. They were able to read John chapter 17, verse 20 and 21 because they had a Bible. Before you had a Bible, you couldn't read that. You didn't know what that said. I want to drop back for one last thing here, that there was this idea that religious division is contrary to not just Jesus's teaching, but to the teachings of the apostles as well. What was the job of the apostles? What were they supposed to do? Go into all the world, right? We see that at the end of all the Gospels. That's the Great Commission, that they're supposed to go out and do that. So I want to give you two verses here before we finish up. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. Jill, you could read this. Most important word is right here. What does that mean? You're begging. He is saying, I am begging you, brethren, not other people who might sometime in the future think about becoming a Christian, but Paul's already calling them brethren, meaning they're what? They already are Christians. He said, I am pleading with you by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ that there be no divisions among you. Now, if you're reading the Bible for the first time, what do you, in 1780, what do you see when you look around the world? You see division. But this verse says there be what? There should be no division. But it's putting it on who to make sure that there is no division? I plead with you, brethren, right there. So the job was of the people. Last thing, we'll finish up. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 4. Linda Denham, you could read this last one. Thank you, ma'am. Now, we're stopping there, but I think that's our target verse to go forward. That there is one body, one spirit. Okay, the spirit is what Ben talked about a minute ago. This Godhead, this idea, this what Christianity is. But the one body would be us, right? The church. But we'll see that efforts to restore, even by people who were on the same team, if we want to go back to what Ben said at the very beginning, they didn't even see eye to eye. The church, what we would call today the Church of Christ, didn't see eye to eye. And there were issues that would emerge that would cause division within. I hope you noticed that I said at the very beginning, you'll see things that are familiar, but I told you 3 different religious groups on the first slide, right? Christian, disciples, and the Church of Christ. But we'll stop there. Anybody have any comments or questions before we call it a night? All right.